Hello, my name is Bruce Miller, and I'm with RimTech, and this session is entitled Purview Retention Labels. This is part of our overall series of advanced EDRMS education, and what I mean by EDRMS is, of course, Electronic Document and Records Management Systems or solutions. So the first thing to get out of the way here is there are three components to any modern EDRMS: the retention schedule, Microsoft Purview, which is a record keeping software, and SharePoint, which is our corporate repository for that contains all the records that we need to manage. So it's important that you know that we have to bring together those three products, and they're pretty different from each other. So what does compliance mean? Well, to me, it has three important characteristics. Number one is that every document complies with the official retention schedule, meaning that every document in SharePoint has been assigned an official rule from the retention schedule, such as, let's say it's expense claim reimbursements. The retention rule might be keep for 5 years, then destroy. Number two is that all the documents are being managed as a record. And that means three things. It means they're immutable, which means nobody can edit or delete the documents or its metadata. Number two is they have a retention rule assigned, as we talked about a moment ago, and that means classified. Classified means a retention rule from the retention schedule has been applied to that document. And the third is that case records are being properly managed. Over 60% of all records these days are event-based. We call them case records, and they have to be properly dealt with, and the event dates acting as triggers in the retention rules. And the third factor for compliance is the proof, which is, can we do a disposition? And in order to do a disposition, we need a classification accuracy rate of a minimum of 85%, meaning that 85 out of every 100 documents have been classified correctly, and we can prove it mathematically. So now, how do we make this happen with Purview? Well, you probably know instinctively what I know by observation over the years, which is that the flow rate of records these days for an organization of about 1,000 users would be 12 records per person per day. Okay, so records aren't static. They flow toward us every single day. And that flow rate is like waves in the ocean. So for this particular example we're going to use today, 1,000 users means 12,000 a day or 2.7 million per year. Where do we get the 12 per day? 2 non-emails and 10 emails that all meet the criteria of a record. That's a typical day in a user. Now, if that were the case, and it most certainly is, then think about that for a minute. 12,000 documents coming in per day that need to be managed as a record. If the records manager needed 1 minute per document to examine it, classify it, check it, or do anything with it, that would be 12,000 minutes or 25 full-time employees. Yeah, it would take 25 days of work for the records manager to touch or do anything with those 12,000 records. So the conclusion here is forget about it. It's just not going to happen. Reality check. In this day and age, records managers cannot touch, interfere with, or get involved with the flow of records because the flow is too big and too fast. Now, here's another important aspect, which is you also know this instinctively, I'm willing to bet as well, which is if I took one document and gave it to 10 users and I asked them two questions. One, is this a record? Two, where does this belong in the retention schedule? You know what'll happen? I'll get up to 10 different answers. Yeah, that's for real. And if I ask them the same question about the same document a month later, I'll get 10 different answers. So what's the conclusion here? The conclusion here is that we cannot reliably count on users to identify what records from non-records and to classify them, okay? So that leads to two schools of thought. One is compliance comes from end users. It's every user has a responsibility to manage their records. And often I've seen this enshrined in corporate policy, which is you're the one creating these records. You have an obligation to manage them as a record. Okay. So that's one school of thought. The second school of thought is, well, wait a minute. We can't rely on the users to do this or do it correctly. Therefore, compliance must come from the organization and be imposed on the end users. In other words, if one user thinks, oh, this document should be kept for 20 years, and another user thinks it should be 5, and yet another thinks it should be 3, they're all wrong. There is no choice here. The retention schedule says it's 15, and that is it. Like it or not, we're going to impose the retention schedule on the documents from the users. Two completely different philosophies. Which one works? The one where we impose it. The other one has not worked in the entire history of EDRMS. I don't think I'll ever see that work in my lifetime. People don't want to manage records. They don't know how to manage records. They never get fired for failing to do so, and they are not motivated. So let's not try to make them do something they don't want to do and they're not very good at. Now, with Purview, here's the issue. Purview, right out of the box, that's the posture of the product, which is compliance comes from end users. This is wrong. You have to flip it upside down. Or I should say it is upside down. You have to flip it right side up. Either way, you have to correct it. So it's important to know that you have to pick a posture and then configure Purview to follow that posture. And I'm here to say that the correct posture is compliance is imposed. It does not come from end users. So at 12,000 records a day, that means the records manager can't intervene in any way. Out of the question. And at the same time, we can't rely on end users to do this for us. So where do we end up? What we end up with is a conclusion that both making documents records, otherwise known as declaration, and classification against the retention schedule has to be automated. Users aren't going to do it. Records managers cannot do it. That only leaves one option, which is automation. And that's what this session is about. Now, we're here to talk about Purview labels. So let's learn a little bit about Purview at a higher level first. Okay, these are the number of points I'd like to make. Number one is that compliance in reality does not come from the users, it comes from the organization. So we have to reverse the posture of Purview. And Microsoft has embedded or built records management into Purview, but it's records their way. It's not records as we have come to know it. So you have to learn what their interpretation of records is. And a big part of that is compliance comes from users, which is wrong. Think of it this analogy. Purview is a bowling ball, large, heavy, and hollow. And inside it is a golf ball. And that golf ball is a subset of Purview features known as records management. So I'm not concerned with the bowling ball. I'm only concerned with the golf ball. Just be aware that when Microsoft says compliance, they're talking about the bowling ball. It's a much larger scope and functionality than simply records management. In order to understand and deploy Purview correctly, now see, I made a mistake. I said Purview. I should have said Purview Records Management. In order to deploy it, you're going to have to learn Microsoft's language of records management. And it is very technical, and that's going to come out in this session. Very, very technical. You're going to have to probably, very likely, get some help from IT in order to manage labels. So don't think of Purview as an application product. It's not. In fact, Purview is not meant to be used by users and never will. It's an administrative set of features that you'll be using, but not end users. Okay? So the secret to deploying it successfully is this, is you got to know what features are bringing down your compliance and you need to avoid them. Similarly, there are some features which are non-compliant, which drive your compliance down, but you need to know how to work around them. And finally, some of their features don't work all that well, and you're going to have to custom program it to get around it. Okay? So those are the three things that I'll be referring to in this session. Now, let's get one thing straight right away. There are two types of rules in Purview, not one. And this is a huge, huge mistake that many casual readers of Purview make. They say, oh, I have a retention schedule with 250 categories in it, maybe 100 different unique retention rules. Well, that's true. And yes, they do have to go into Purview, but that's not what you need to do. You need to do a lot more. There are two types of rules you have to put into Purview. First, retention rules. And they're classic rules such as keep 5 years and delete, keep 10 years, 25 years, whatever. That's straightforward and simple. But that's not what matters in Purview. What matters is the content rules. The content rules are rules you have to write to do something with the retention rules. And in Purview, these content rules are called auto-apply policies, okay? Now, you're going to have to create them, and put them into Purview, and also in your retention schedule. So yeah, your retention schedule is going to have to change. And I have a recorded video on that in its entirety. So the content rules, their purpose is to say, for this content in SharePoint, what retention rule do I want to apply to that content? Okay, so make it very clear here. The retention rules by and of themselves do nothing. Purview will not help you once you get the retention rules in there. You have to build these content rules to do something with those retention rules. And that's going to be the large focus of this session. Okay? So let's take a look at retention rules theory, and then we'll apply it to Purview labels, because a label in Purview is a retention rule. So all retention rules have three components: a trigger, a retention period, and a disposition action. The trigger is either time-based or event-based. Now, I'm leaving some additional capabilities out because I want to keep this simple. But by and large, it's age, which is time trigger, or event. So an age trigger would say, when this document is 5 years old, it's out of here. An event trigger would say 5 years after this adventure, such as a union grievance or an investigation or an audit is over, then wait 10 more years and then delete it or transfer it to archives, whatever. But those are the two trigger types, okay? Now, here is a retention schedule fragment on the left with 15 business activities. I refer to those as categories. Each one has a retention rule, but you might notice that the same retention rule, such as keep 5 years and delete, is repeated across multiple activities. So if we sort this table by the rule code, because every retention rule has to have a code, then we start to see the pattern, the repeats. So here in this example, for 15 activities, we only have 5 uniquely different retention rules. They're just reused across multiple activities or categories. So the total number of unique retention rules is actually quite small in a typical retention schedule. Okay? Now, what is a content rule? A content rule is a rule you have to create to do something with a retention rule. So here's what they look like. We have 3 parts: a name, a condition, and a retention rule. The name is just that. The condition is what condition has to be met so that I can identify the documents in SharePoint that I want to apply this rule to. For example, if the library is audits and the metadata column final report contains yes, then apply the retention rule called audits, final report, whatever that may be. Okay? So 3-part content rules. Now this, one of my favorite slides, this is the beating heart of an EDRMS. If you understand this one slide, you're miles ahead of the game, okay? So we have auto-apply policies on our left, which I refer to generically as content rules, and we have retention rules on the right, okay? How many rules on the right? 50 maybe? Worst case, 100, because they're all just mathematical permutations that are different from the others. So there's not a lot, maybe 50 of them. You could pump these into Purview in an afternoon easily, okay? This is where the work lies. You have to create content rules that do something with those retention rules. For example, let's look at projects in the middle here. In the library called projects, we have a column, metadata column called document type, and it can contain maybe 10 or 12 different settings, planning documents, technical documents, budgeting, and so on. And if the library name is projects and the document type contains the word planning, then apply this retention rule to those documents. Projects, comma, 5, comma, destroy. So if we follow the arrow, we go down to the 5th retention rule, which is named projects 5 destroy, and the guts of it, the detail within it is project end date plus 5 years and then destroy. That's the 3-part retention rule, the trigger, the period, and the action after the end of the life cycle. So you can see here that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different combinations of what the doc type could be. So we're going to write 4 content rules for that library. For audits above, we only have 2 situations. You are either the final report, which is yes, or you're not, which is no. Each one applies a different retention rule because the final report equals yes has a much higher retention value than the other documents that were used to create the final report. So if we imagine a typical organization of 1,000 users that would have a real retention schedule, software-ready retention schedule of 800 categories, turns out statistically that the average number of rules, content rules, per category, which equates to a library in SharePoint, would be 3. So if we in fact have 800 categories, we have 800 libraries, and therefore 2,400 content rules. So yeah, that's why this slide is so important, because this is the real work of retention labels. The real work is not putting in your retention labels. That's easy, child's play. It's this stuff. What are you going to do with those retention rules? And let me make one point really clear. If you do not create these content rules, Purview does nothing for you. It cannot, because you have to point those rules to content in SharePoint so that it knows what to do with those retention rules. So please, please, please know that this understanding and deploying Purview is really not about retention labels. It's about what you do with those labels. So before I exit, content rules are called auto apply policies, and retention rules are called labels, retention labels. Now, there's a lot of policies going on in Purview and a lot of labels. So what's the difference? You can have a retention policy which is a rule. Example, keep 5 years, then destroy. You can have a label, which is a rule, and it can say, keep 5 years and destroy. Yeah, both are doing exactly the same thing, but you have to know the difference. A retention policy, that rule is applied to a place. And wherever that place may be, anywhere underneath that place, such as libraries within a site in SharePoint, all gets the same rule. Everything that inherits underneath it, that rule passes down to every library, every folder, every document set, and every document in that location. Okay? There is no immutability, so it's not being managed as a record. It has nothing to do with the retention schedule. So a retention policy is not records management. It has a use for cleanup, perhaps, but it is not records management. A label, it is applied, it's a rule, it's a retention rule, but it is applied to an item. What's an item? An item is Microsoft's language for document, whatever the heck it is in SharePoint. They call it an item. So the rule is applied directly to the item, like a piece of sticky note, okay? It has 3 triggers, a label, time-based label, an event, or an age, which is good for record keeping. It can use trainable classifiers, which is AI, but we're not going to get into that in this session. and it has disposition review at the end, and it marks the document as a label, which, sorry, as a record, which is exactly what we need. So we need this. We need to build and apply retention labels. My advice, stay away entirely from retention policies. Don't even create any. Why? Because they end up competing with the labels. And I have a complete video on retention policies and why you need to avoid them. Now, this is the next thing you have to understand about labels in Purview, which is the business of publishing a label. I'm going to use a bit of an analogy here, okay? A label, or sorry, publishing is the mechanism by which Purview makes a label available to a product, okay? Now, the language is all over the place. I'm going to use Microsoft's language. Here we have 5 labels and 2 label policies. A label policy is a bag of labels, a container of labels. Label policy A has or contains labels 1 and 3. Label policy B contains labels 3, 4, and 5. Notice label 3 exists in both, which is fine. But what we're doing with a label policy is we're making it available to what Microsoft calls a workload. What is a workload? A product. I'm only interested in 3: SharePoint, Exchange, and OneDrive. That's the only 3 I'm going to address in any of my sessions. Now, you'll also notice that in the documentation, Microsoft also refers to their products as locations. They use both terms. But the idea of publishing a label is to make the labels in the container available to the product. So this is my analogy. Imagine the product is a house, a good old-fashioned Georgian house with a wraparound covered porch. Imagine that in your mind's eye. So it has rooms inside, and inside the rooms are people known as users, right? So when you put labels in a bag and you publish it to the workload, i.e., what you're doing is you're carrying the bag across the street, dropping it off on the front porch in this house. Turn around and run away as fast as you can, because once you drop the bag on the front porch, every user from every room can come out, grab whatever labels they want from that bag, and put them to work in any room in that house. Okay? They can do whatever they want with it. You have no control. Okay? So that's what happens if you publish a label. Now, remember back at the beginning of the session, I said that compliance does not come from users. That's the wrong way to use Purview. The right way to use Purview is to use it to impose compliance on end users. Here's what you need to know. If you publish a label, well, let me back up a bit. When you first deploy SharePoint, it does not have any means of allowing the user to apply a retention label. There's no button on the screen. But the first time you publish a label, any label, the button wakes up. And it wakes up in Exchange, Outlook, or SharePoint, Exchange, and SharePoint. Now the users are in control. Now the users can go to the button on the screen and pick any label they want for any reason at any time. And they can pick a 5-year label on a Monday. They can change it to a 15-year label on a Tuesday and a 50-year label on a Friday, depending on their mood. Okay? That is not compliance. That's giving control of the shop away to the users, which is the opposite of what we want. So to me, that's non-compliance. So what you got to do is you have to avoid publishing a label. Do not do it. Because the minute you do, the first time you do it, you wake up the button. And once the button is awake, users can use it whether you want them to or not. And if you do impose records, they can impose it back on you. They get the last word. So therefore, you lose your compliance. So here's what the button looks like in SharePoint. This is the document information pane, and there's a button right there, apply label. You never want to see that button, ever, ever, okay? Not good, not good at all. In my opinion, if you see that button, you've lost the game already. your compliance is out the window. You cannot be compliant anymore if that button shows up. Okay? Why? Because users can pick whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, and they can keep changing their mind day in and day out. You have no control. Having 1,000 users doing whatever the heck they want is not my definition of compliance. Proper definition of compliance is impose it. They don't get to choose. Okay, now let's get a little deeper into retention labels. So there are three considerations. The first is the label itself. Pretty simple, just has three parts. The trigger, the retention period, and the action at the end, which is typically destroy. Now, does Purview have a transfer capability? No. Can you build one? Yes. So it can do a transfer, but it requires custom programming. Scope. You've got to know what a scope is. Every label needs a scope, either a static scope or an adaptive scope. We'll cover that in detail later, but scope is the range of the label. How broadly are you looking at to deploy that label across what products and what locations within those products? The third piece, and this is the important piece, this is where we're going to focus a lot. Auto apply policy or the content rule, which is what are you going to do with this retention label? Okay. So you've got tons and tons of content in SharePoint, but what labels are you going to apply to it? So you can say for library, all the content that's in library X with metadata Y, then apply this rule to that content. And in order to do auto apply policies properly, you have to use KQL, Keyword Query Language, which we'll talk about later. Now, this is what your file plan looks like. That's what Purview calls the retention schedule, a file plan. And in our records language, we think of each row here as a category, right? It's a business activity and a retention rule for the records of that activity. And we typically see things like the description, whether we need an authority code to do the disposal, whether it's up for review, whether it's vital or not, sometimes a legal citation, typical stuff from a typical retention schedule. Not here, okay? If you want to add a new category, you have to create a label. So each row in the file plan is a label, which in turn is a records category. Business activity, which is a name, and then the retention rule, three-part rule. Trigger, right, which is based on the retention period, which is called the duration, and then the action at the end. You won't find that. Well, you will in a way. The action at the end is either delete right away, which is a violation of compliance, or put it up for review. That's it, right? So it's pretty lean and mean there. So let's go ahead and create our first label. Here we go. We need file plan descriptors. Descriptors are the reference ID, function, activities, whether you need an authority code, and any legal citation. Pretty routine stuff. It's called descriptive data because nothing acts on it mathematically. That's why they're called descriptors. You put in whatever you want. I'm not going to bother with that. Okay, now the label settings. What I'm doing with these screens is I'm walking you through the wizard, the on-screen wizard that you have to fill in order to create your label. We're going step by step. Here's the first step, which is your label settings. You have three choices. Two of them, don't go there. Enforce actions after a specific period. No, 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 no. We want real records management, which means everything will be locked down as a record, immutable. It means that at the end of the life cycle, we're going to review it in advance of disposition. Not negotiable, okay? So we eliminate this, just label the items. We eliminate enforce actions after a specified period. We don't want the machine doing any deletion. We as records people want to control that deletion in the review process. This is what we want right here, which is retained forever or for a specific period, which is what we're going to specify. Now we have the screen here to fill out, which is define the retention period. So what are our choices? Well, we can specify the number of years right here, right? If I click this drop down, this is what I see. And we have start the retention period based on. That's the trigger. And there are 4 triggers. Here they are. 1, when the item was created. 2, when they were last modified. 3, when they were labeled. Or 4, based on an event. So let's take a look at these 4. First one, when items were created. Well, that's kind of a lie because it's age-based retention that we're doing here. And how do you calculate the age of a document? Well, it's simple. And this is what Purview does, by the way. We take today's date, we subtract the date of the document from it, and what does that tell us? The document's age. So if we have a 100-page PDF that says on the front cover, June 1st, 2010, well, in 2026, it's a 16-year-old document, right? So then we go to put it in SharePoint. But here's what Purview does. Purview says, how do I calculate the age? Same way. I take today's date and I subtract from it the created date. But the created date is not the date of the document. It's the date it was put into SharePoint. So it's a lie. It's a lie. And is that a problem? Yes. Is it a huge problem? No. Um, it means that your age-based retention calculations will never truly be fully accurate, but it's not a huge deal. What I advise my clients to do is just add an extra year onto your retention periods because that way we're not too concerned if it's off by a week, a day, a month, or even a year, right? So that's not the end of the world. It is in some cases, though. Okay, so now we've got that out of the way. Now, the next step is to choose what happens during the retention period. We want it marked as a record. There is no other option. So do not pick this one. Retain items even if users delete. No, 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 no. And unlock a record, the whole business of unlocking is toxic. Don't even go there. So we're going to just do mark items as a record, nothing else. Now, this is not part of the wizard, but it's an important screen you need to see, which is this is a settings button, and it was put in there actually at my request, believe it or not, about a year ago. So what this does is it allows you to shut down 2 non-compliant features or features that are hurting compliance instead of helping it. One is allowing users to delete lockdown records. No, let's not go there. So turn it off. Okay. Number 2 is record versioning. What is record versioning? I thought a record was supposed to be locked down in order to be managed as a record. Yes, it does, and it has to stay locked down. This feature allows you to unlock a record and then make all kinds of changes to it and then relock it if you think of it. Anyway, those 2 features are a nightmare. So turn them both off. No unlocking and no deleting of locked documents. Make sure you do that early, okay? You're going to avoid so many problems. So back to the wizard. Next step in the wizard is what happens after the retention period. Well, we certainly don't want this one. Delete automatically. Just imagine you're sound asleep and at 3 in the morning, Purview deletes 657,000 documents without your knowledge. Not good, right? So we must have full auditable control of that deletion. Automatic deletion should not happen. And might I point out that it happens every single day. Today, 5,000 were deleted. Tomorrow, 17. The next day, 50,000. Can't have that going on. So avoid it like the plague. Change the label? Excuse me? No. The label or the retention rule is a retention rule. Why would we change it? Run a Power Automate flow. What does that mean? That means at the end of the life cycle, I'm going to write some programming code, some custom programming to do what I want to do. That is a good thing. Why? Because Purview has no transfer. So how do you transfer to archives at the end of a life cycle? You do this. You run a Power Automate flow. I'm going to have a whole video just on that alone. Deactivate retention settings. Again, excuse me? Why would we do that? So the only acceptable button here is start a disposition review. So let's do that. First step is this, which is we have to have a minimum of one review stage. It's not complicated. It's just a period of time. And do not turn this on. Automatic stage approval. What that does is it means in this stage, the things automatically get approved, which means they automatically get deleted, it's just non-compliant. So don't do that. What we do have to do, though, because we can't even get past this step in the wizard without it, is we have to create a reviewer. How do you specify a reviewer? It comes from the Active Directory. What's an Active Directory? It's the list of valid users for SharePoint today. Today. So if you put an email, you have to pick a valid user. I pick myself here. Will that user be around 10, 15, 25 years from now? Of course not. So what do I recommend you do? Don't. Instead, create a special email address just for the review process. Now, that means that all the records, all 2.7 million per year that are up for disposition anyway, will go to one email inbox. That's exactly what you want. Why? Because the disposition review process is too dangerous to use in Purview. Do not use it. Another video on that is coming up shortly, but I'll show in that video how to take care of that. But for now, you have to pick a valid user email address. And that user can get emails every single day, literally, about documents that are falling into a disposition eligibility state. I don't even think you want that to happen. But the whole disposition thing is a separate topic. Now we're done. Simple summary on screen. But there's one word on this screen that really matters. And it kind of slips by, but I want to bring your attention to it. And here it is right here. What does this mean? This means that no matter what you did in that label, the end of the life action is always delete. Always. Got that? Always. Unless you built a custom workflow. Okay? So just be very, very, very aware of that. Now, so we've created our label. The wizard takes one more step, which is, okay, your label is done. Congratulations. What do you want to do with it? This is where the work begins. Okay, this is where you really have to start understanding what Purview does. So there's three choices. Publish it. No. Publishing means put it in a bag, drop it off on the front porch, run like hell, and lose your project. No, don't do it. Look, it even says right here, when published, users can manually apply to it. That's exactly what we don't want. Again, you make this mistake once, you're only allowed one mistake. If you publish one label, you're done. You're toast. Now the button is awake, and now every user can pick any label and apply it to anything for any reason, and you can do nothing about it. That will destroy your compliance completely. So do not go there. This is what we want right here. Auto apply this label to a specific type of content, either matching certain conditions, which is exactly what we want. We want to apply labels ourselves that are correct. That'll allow us to do it. Do nothing, that's fine. That's what I click every single time. I say, I'm done with the label. I'll build my auto apply content rule later. So let's do that now. Let's go ahead and do something with this label. Do something means stick it on a piece of content, i.e. an item in SharePoint, right? So there's 5 ways to do it. And I'm here to say only one of them is the proper way to do it. Okay, one. And that is auto apply. Now, what's wrong with the other methods? Well, manual, well, we already talked about that. The last thing we want. In fact, we must avoid it at all costs. No users pick labels. This one here is a default in a SharePoint library. Nothing wrong with that at all. However, you can only default one label per library, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in a healthy EDRMS, we typically have minimum of 3 rules per library, so it's highly, highly limited. Trainable classifier and DUMs are artificial intelligence that acts on the content of a document. Not safe. We need predictability so that we hit our classification accuracy. We can't depend on words or phrases inside a document. And think about this for a minute. 4/5 of all modern records, digital records, are emails. When's the last time you saw an email that said this? Here it is. Or as requested. Or approved. Where's the content in that, right? 4/5 of all records are emails. Outlook email rule. Again, we cannot depend on content. So what can we depend on? Metadata. We can control the metadata. That's what we need to do with auto apply, and that's exactly what we're going to do, okay? So auto apply is safe. Why? Because of a secret. Bullet number 1 here. The auto apply method of applying a retention rule doesn't wake up the apply label button. It doesn't wake it up. So it's not publishing. And there's the secret. If you have a label, you have 2 ways to treat that label. You can either publish it or not publish it. Don't publish ever, because it wrecks your system. You have to do something that does not publish it, and auto-apply does not publish it, okay? Reason number 2 is you're in complete control, okay? Which is what we need, because we need to impose record keeping on users, not the other way around. Reason 3, it's dependable, because you can set and manage all the metadata you want. So if you know that if a particular document has a piece of metadata called, I don't know, final report, then you can act on that in an auto apply rule, right? And you can build that metadata, control it, use it. You're in full control, dependable. And the final reason is it doesn't depend on words inside the document, which Microsoft calls content, right? Remember this. As tempting as AI might sound for classification, it depends on words and phrases in the document. That is not dependable. It's just not. We need minimum 85%. So don't go there. Let's do something that we have full control of, safe, dependable, reliable. Auto apply rules, the way to go. So let's build one, shall we? It has a name and a description. I'm going to call this one Audit Final Report. So now, first step in the wizard is I got 4 choices. Okay, nothing wrong with the first choice, but we're not here to talk about sensitivity. We're here to talk about records, so that's irrelevant. Apply label to content that matches a trainable classifier. Oh, no, 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 no. That's the AI thing again. Apply label to cloud attachments. Not even completely sure what that is, but I'm cool with it. I've just never done it. What I want is to manage my records, and I need button number 2. Apply label to content that contains properties, specific properties. This one, danger, right? Specific words or phrases is just another way to say use AI and depend on words inside the document or the email. No, not going there. We need properties. Now, here's where you specify the actual guts of the rule, which is called a condition, okay? The condition says, what content are you talking about? Which content in SharePoint am I going to put this label on? Well, the condition specifies that content. And here, what I want is I want one that says the library name equals audits, and the field final report, the column final report, contains yes. That's the content I'm pointing to. It'll hopefully only be one document. It could be more than one, but this is a very specific requirement I have, right? So what do I type into my condition? This. How do I interpret that? Well, this is the library, this is the operator, this is the column name, and this is the value of the column name. What am I doing here? I'm using a language, a kind of a miniature programming language called a KQL, Keyword Query Language. It's very simple. It is simple in nature. It's a bit of a stretch to learn it, but it's pretty powerful. And you have to use it. You have no choice. It's based on property value pairs. So what you put in as a condition is a property, which is a metadata field or some other property, a colon, and then the value, which is what does this property contain, right? In this case, the library contains the word audits, and refinable string 22 contains the word yes. Now, what the heck is refinable string 22? Well, we're about to find out, but before I do, please know this. When you're playing around with KQL, remember, we have an average of 3 uh, content rules per library. If you have 800 libraries, which you should, then we're talking 2,400 of these. There's no error checking. Let me repeat this. There is no error checking. That means you make one little mistake and it'll fail. So you have to be extremely careful that to get everything perfect in every one of your rules, okay? Now let's dig in a little deeper and find out why the heck are we typing these weird symbols and this refinable string? Well, that has to do with the guts of Purview itself, or I should say the guts of M365, which is a platform. What you have to do is, let me back up. You have to realize something, which is there's a limitation of, of these auto-apply rules, and that is you cannot identify a column by name, okay? You cannot identify a column by name. You have to substitute it for a refinable string. So you have to build a refinable string that refers or points to the actual column that you're interested in, which in this case is final report, okay? How do you do that? Well, first you got to go down to the substrate. It takes 6 steps to navigate down to the substrate. Think of it like the basement of Purview. But when you're down there, you're going to be in a place where you're going to see all the properties of all Microsoft's products. You have to navigate your way around and find final report. And then you have to map it to a refinable string, which you can subsequently use in the condition. Okay? Now, this diagram here is Microsoft's diagram for the substrate. This is mine. Okay? Pick whichever you like, but this is, I find this one more understandable. Crawled properties versus managed properties versus refinable string. You have to understand this. A crawled property is what you see in SharePoint. Final report, yes or no. A managed property is a equivalent of it. There's a long story as to why they're necessary, but we don't have enough time for that today. What you need to know is that you have to find the managed property for that crawled property. When you find it, you have to map it to a refinable string, and the refinable string goes in the condition in the KQL query. That's what's necessary to make this work, okay? These are what your crawled properties look like. They're not very familiar looking, right? But they are there. Every single column in SharePoint is in there. And what do the managed properties look like? This is what they look like. Again, not very user-friendly. I'm not sure I said this before, but Purview is not meant for end users, right? It's not. It's a highly technical product, and the user interface is not very forgiving. So you have to use it for KQL queries for your auto-apply rules. So now, there's a limitation built in here of refinable strings. So refinable string is an equivalent of a crawled property, i.e. a column. Here's an example of me typing in 1, 2, 3, 4 activities, standard operating procedures, union grievances, and so on. And I wanted some content rules, right? Some auto-apply policies. So the first one I wanted, if published equals yes, I wanted a 25-year retention. If published equals no, I want a 5-year. In order to do that, I mapped refinable string 01 to the internal managed field for published, okay? So what does my KQL query look like? Library : standard operating procedures and refinable string 01 : yes, right? So if the library is SOPs and published equals yes. For my second rule, I had the same thing. Library, SOPs, and refinable string 1, which is published, equals no. So I've now used up one of those refinable strings by assigning it to published. Okay. Now I went on to union grievances. I had a column called document type. Well, document type is a different column. So I had to map that to a different refinable string, which I called refinable string 2. So now I've consumed or used 2 refinable strings. So I keep going, keep going, keep going. And I found out that pretty much every library I need to build a new refinable string. Here's the rub. In M365, you only get 99 refinable strings, and then you run out. That is a deadly serious restriction. Are there ways around it? Yes. Some of it are tips and tricks. Some of them are clean tips and tricks. Some of them are kind of weird and strange, but you have to work around this limitation. We do it every day of the week. Okay. And this session is far too short to get into it, but just know that you can't go on this path. You can't go down this road. It won't work, right? You won't get very far. Okay, now the next step is the scope of the policy, and the scope says I have to have an admin units. Don't worry about admin units. All they are is they're in the Active Directory, which is this giant database of all the users of M365 by name, your department, etc., right? And what products you have access to and what locations you have privileges to within those locations. So admin units just simply says who can run and edit and build and manage this content rule or auto apply policy. That's all an admin unit is. Don't even worry about it. Okay. Now, this you do have to worry about. Static or adaptive scopes. What is a scope? A scope is a range within the Microsoft product line that you're going to apply this rule to. The range. That's why they call it a scope, right? You can have an adaptive scope or a static scope. A static scope is simple. Tell me what product, i.e. SharePoint, and what locations within that product, i.e. what sites, and potentially what libraries. You just tell me where I'm going to look. And Purview will not look outside that range when it's applying the rule. So you're just setting the boundary, the range, okay? An adaptive scope is far more complicated. An adaptive scope says, instead of specifying where, specify who. More on that in a minute. But you can see here that what Microsoft calls a location is actually what I call a product, Exchange, SharePoint, or OneDrive. Okay? And I think there are 13 products in the portfolio right now, 13 products, something like that. But notice this, this is what you have to know. Once you pick a product, you have to pick a location within the product. So location means product, and location also means a place inside that product. So 2 meanings of the word location. So let's take a closer look at an adaptive scope. And I'm not advising you. In fact, you know what I think? I think adaptive scopes are wonderful, but they're great for e-discovery and holes, legal holes. They are not of value for auto-apply content rules. So I would not use them or recommend them for content rules. But for now, we need to understand them. So here's a quick example. An adaptive scope is a range, where to look in the product line, the Microsoft product line. Your KQL query, your actual content rule, is what to look for within that range. Okay, so adaptive scope is just a boundary. It's a boundary, right? So here we have 3 scope types: user, SharePoint sites, or M365 groups. So it's your range, the range of users. It could be one range, but it covers all their email. It could be an entire OneDrive account and every file they have in that OneDrive account. And that's why I say adaptive scope is great for e-discovery and for legal holes. Perfect, just what you need. But for content records management, no, I don't think so. Not at all. Because what we want is to apply retention rules to specific types of documents. That's really not what this is meant for. Okay? So here I'm going with an adaptive scope, nonetheless, just to show you how it works. I chose the user mode, and it says select the users by intra ID attributes. What does that mean? That just means who of all the users. Intra ID is just the Active Directory. It's the directory of users. That's all that means. And in it is first name, last name, sometimes even photo, sometimes department. So here is an example where I chose myself. My last name is Miller, department is HR, city is Ottawa. Okay. And that now sets the scope or the boundary of where we're going to apply this retention label to. Again, I think it's perfect for e-discovery and legal holds because it's all about the person, everything they're doing. What is records management about? Records management is about zeroing in on specific documents of specific subjects and applying a suitable retention rule. That's not really what this is meant for, okay? I think this is not meant for records. And finally, in the wizard, we're going to choose a label to auto apply. And this is my label, 7 years, review, then delete. And of course, it's a record. Darn well better be, because if we're not picking a record, we're not managing it as a record. So we're done now. So this is the summary that puts up on the screen. The wizard displays this. And you can see here in this example, I have this retention rule, this label, will be applied to Exchange and OneDrive. Those are the products. I use an adaptive scope. So it'll only be to documents with, it'll only be, in this case, for Exchange user Bruce, who happens to be in Ottawa and the department is HR. And the retention rule or label that I'm applying is test 88, okay? That's basically how it works. So what did I leave out? I left out a ton of stuff. I left out a lot of permutations, but I left out a lot of non-record stuff. You can create retention labels that don't make it a record. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in pure, real, genuine records management, which means every label I create will declare it to be a record. It'll be immutable. I'm not fooling around or messing around with locks and unlocks. That's a fool's game, fool's game. So anyway, now we're done. Now you've got 4 questions we had to ask. How do we delete a label? How do we edit an existing one or peel one off from a document? Notice the difference between bullets 1 and 3. 1 is delete a label. Number 3 is how do we remove a label? What's the difference? Deleting a label is to make it disappear, go away. It doesn't exist anymore. Removing a label says, oops, I stuck it on the wrong document. Peel it off the right one, put it on the right one. Did I say that right? Peel it off the wrong document and put it back on the right one, or not. But you're removing a label from a document. It's not the same as destroying the label, right? And number 4 is how do we take a label and replace it with a different one? Hugely important. So now we're in a world of so many permutations. It's mind-boggling. What can I do with a label? Well, it depends on whether it's published or not published. Now remember, don't ever publish anything. So in my world, I don't run into this situation because I will never publish. Number 2, how was it applied? Was it auto-applied or was it applied by some other method? Because there's 7 different total methods you can use to apply a label. Again, in my world, I don't have this problem because I only auto-apply. I will never use another method, okay? So I don't have that mathematical permutation. Number 3, is a label applied or not? Because you can create all the labels you want and never do anything with them. So what you can do to and with that label depends on whether or not it has been applied to one or more documents. And finally, what's inside the label? Well, it's either a time-based label or an event-based label. And again, what you can do to and with that label depends on what's inside it, whether it's a time-based label or an event-based label. You got to keep all 4 in mind. Okay. So here I have 14 documents and 5 labels. Notice label 4 is unassigned. It hasn't been assigned to any of these documents. Label 1 says 5 years and delete, and it's applied to 4 items. And let's pretend for the moment it has been published. Not that I would ever do that, but they could have been published, right? Label 2, applied to 3 items, has not been published. It's been auto-applied. Label 3 is a different retention period applied to 3 items, also not published. And label 5 is event-based, but not published because it was auto-applied. So you have to keep these things in your head when you're deciding, okay, I want to make a change or I want to do something to that label or with that label. Well, you have to know what kind of label it is, what's inside it, and what you did with it. Okay? Now, this is a bit of a stretch, but there are 2 ways to apply a label. We're now officially off grid. We're not on the Microsoft path anymore. Okay? We are going somewhere, which is there's 2 ways to use Purview. One is use the GUI, the graphical user interface, right here. In other words, we're not going to do any custom programming. We're just going to use the user interface on screen. But there's another way to use it as well, which is use custom programming via a Purview application programmer's interface. Does that require programming skill? Yes. Would I expect you to do it? No. Um, uh, there's even a number of languages that programmers could use. But here's the rub. The GUI, the GUI, is highly, highly restrictive. There's not a lot you can do with it. But you go under the hood, custom programming, limitless. You can do almost anything. Let me put it this way. You can do a lot more via custom programming than you can without it. Okay? That's all I'm trying to say with this particular slide. But the funny, weird thing is that a given label, whether applied or not, what you can do with that label depends on whether you're using the GUI or custom programming. One more time, there's only so much you can do with the user interface, but you can do a lot more with custom programming, okay? And I can tell you this, is that here at RimTech, in our practice for our clients, guess what? We don't use the GUI. Okay. Number 1, there's 4 things you got to know. Number 1 is how to delete a label. Well, it depends on whether it's applied or not, obviously. If it's not applied, it's just sitting in free space, just go ahead and blow it away. No big deal. The GUI, fine. API, fine. Now, what if it's been applied though? And remember, a label can be sitting in your pile of 50 or so labels, but it's been stuck on to 50,000 documents. Totally normal, right? Well, how do you delete it? Well, if it's a time-based, then you can use the user interface to delete it. But if it has been used inside a policy, you cannot use the GUI to delete it. So you're kind of out of luck, okay? If it's been applied to 1 or more documents, but it's event-based, you cannot delete that label. Impossible, okay? Now, you've got labels, and they're out there in the world, they're doing their thing, and you realize you made a mistake. So you want to edit an existing record label. Now remember, the theme of everything I do is consistent. Every label is a record label, which means it's immutable. And I refuse to get into the business of unlocking because that's a fool's game. That is terrible. So we're going to keep it locked always, okay? That simplifies life too. So we want to edit. Well, there's 2 paths. One is, has this label been applied yet to 1 or more items? If so, then we can change the name of the label, the description, and the descriptors. But what we cannot change is the record equals yes or no. Actually, this is a mistake. We can change the retention period. We can change it. So this is a mistake I'll have to fix in the future version. But yes, if you have a 5-year label and it's stuck on 50,000 documents, oh, I know why it's down there now. and it's stuck on 50,000 documents and you want to say, oops, I didn't mean 5 years, I meant 15, then you can make that change. The reason I put that down here is because we haven't been able to prove it. We do everything in my presentations is test it, and we haven't completed the test. We've never been able to get a successful test of that. Why do we do that? Because we find that the documentation is inconsistent sometimes, and sometimes just plain wrong. And there are also features of previews that just don't work. So we have to test it before we move it up here. Do I think it belongs up here? I do. I do. I do. Um, you cannot change the trigger though, and you cannot change the disposition at the end of its life. So those are your restrictions when you are trying to edit an existing label. Now, if the label hasn't been applied, it's just sitting in free space, hasn't never been used, then you can change anything you want in there. What about when we apply a label and it's stuck onto a document, but I want to peel it back off? Well, depends on whether it's published or not. If it's been published, which is evil, rotten, terrible, do not do it. But if you did, then you can remove it easily via the user interface, but only one at a time. What does that mean? That means that if it's been applied to 50,000 documents, you have to do this 50,000 times. I hope you have a strong finger, right? There's no way to bulk remove it. You need to be able to bulk remove it, right? Because if you have a problem with a label, you got to remove it from wherever it has been applied, right? What if it has not been published? Well, you can't remove it via the GUI. You cannot. But you can via custom programming, right? And you can do it onesies and twosies, single or bulk. But again, anytime you use custom programming, you're paying someone to write that programming, right? They have to write it, test it, do it, move on. So that's it for labels. I could spend another 2 to 3 hours easily and keep going, but I just didn't want to jam too much in here. The biggest piece I left out was event-based. And I left that out because it is so tricky and so complicated that I'm going to dedicate a full session just on event-based labels, okay? So keep an eye open for that. Now, this is we're done, we're finished with the labels. Here's the big picture. First, you need to take your retention schedule and change it. You have to generate a whole new retention schedule to pump into Purview. Why? Because it has to be machine readable, right? And that constitutes your retention labels. So you have to load the retention labels into SharePoint. That's not a big deal. That's pretty straightforward. This is the big heavy work down here. In order for your EDRMS to work, you need a SharePoint IA or information architecture. In this case, it's approximately 800 libraries, 14 columns per library, gives you 11,200 columns, all the detail, okay? So you have to figure out what that architecture will be first. Then you have to build it, which we call deploy, right? Defining it could take you a year. Building it could take you a year, okay? So what we've done is we came up with some tools we call Catalyst, and we've got that down to a single day. So we've taken all the labor out of deploying SharePoint and put it into a button, okay? All of this information architecture. Now, only then can you sit down and write your 2400 content rules, okay? Why do you need the content rules? Because the retention rules won't do anything for you, as I said earlier. So you got to realize that even though we passed step 3 and we have all our retention rules safely tucked away into Purview, it won't do a thing for you. Why do we have to wait until step 6 after we've deployed SharePoint? Because your content rules, what Purview calls your auto-apply policies, contain the names of those sites, the names of those libraries, and the names of those columns. Okay? They won't work until you have the SharePoint deployed. So therefore, Step 6 is at the end. You have to fully deploy your SharePoint before you can do your content rules. And you have to have content rules before you can do anything with your retention rules. That's why I'm showing you this diagram, how it fits into the big picture. So in summary, labels are simple. The real story is what are you going to do with them? Those are the auto-apply policies. Number 2, please only use auto-apply. There is no other safe way to apply retention labels. Number 3, be prepared for a major investment of effort in order to build these auto-apply rules. I estimate, back of napkin calculation, 20 minutes per rule. I dare you to multiply that by 2,400. That's going to tell you how much effort this truly is. Now let me back up a bit. You see this step here? This is the step where you create all those rules. That could take you months. In fact, it will. So what we're working on now at RimTech is we're building another Catalyst tool to automate that. So we've already got this step down from a year to pretty much a day or two. And this one, several months down to an hour or so. Check back. And I'm going to have a movie on that. Trust me. Okay, so number 4 is remember, please, that you're highly limited by the user interface. If you really want to get serious about building, deploying, and managing your labels, you're pretty much going to have to go under the hood, which means custom programming. That's what we do. We've decided that, no, we don't like this user interface at all. We're not going to use it. Pretty much. Okay. Long-term, big picture, that's where you're likely to end up. And that's it. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and be sure to check out our websites and our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.